janitor with no college degree, no training, no connections, quietly built an $8 million fortune. During the same years, a Harvard-educated executive with an MBA and decades of Wall Street experience went completely broke. How is that possible? How does a man who swept floors at JCPenney outperform someone with the best education money can buy? The answer has nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with behavior. This is The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel, and it might change the way you think about every dollar you earn, spend, and save. Morgan Housel opens this book with a story he witnessed firsthand. While working as a valet at a luxury hotel in Los Angeles, he watched a technology executive, a genuine genius who had designed and patented a key component in Wi-Fi routers, behave with money like a reckless teenager. This man carried bricks of $100 bills in his pocket. He showed them off to anyone who would look. One day, he bought several $1,000 gold coins, gathered his friends by the ocean, and they threw the coins into the sea, skipping them like rocks, just for laughs. Not long after, that man went broke. Now compare him to Ronald Read. Born in rural Vermont, first person in his family to finish high school, and he had to hitchhike to get there. He worked at a gas station for 25 years. Then he swept floors at JCPenney for 17 more. He bought a tiny two-bedroom house for $12,000 and lived there for the rest of his life. His main hobby was chopping firewood. When Ronald Read died in 2014 at age 92, he left behind more than $8 million. He donated $2 million to his stepchildren and over $6 million to his local hospital and library. The secret? There was no secret. No lottery win. No inheritance. He simply saved what little he could, invested it in solid stocks, and then he waited for decades. Now here's the contrast. Around the same time, a man named Richard Fuscone, Harvard-educated, former Merrill Lynch executive, praised by colleagues for his leadership and sound judgment, went bankrupt. He had borrowed heavily to expand an 18,000 square foot mansion with 11 bathrooms, 2 elevators, 2 swimming pools, and 7 garages. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, it wiped him out. His home was eventually sold at auction for 75% less than its insured value. Think about that for a moment. A janitor with no financial education built lasting wealth. An elite financial executive lost everything. In what other field does that happen? You would never see a janitor perform heart surgery better than a trained surgeon. You would never see someone with no engineering background design a better skyscraper than the world's top architects. But in finance, it happens all the time. And that, Housel argues, is because financial success is not a hard science. It's a soft skill. How you behave matters more than what you know. That's the core thesis of this entire book, and over the next hour, we're going to walk through every key idea, 20 chapters of counterintuitive, deeply human insights about why we do what we do with money and how we can do it better. Let's start with something that might surprise you. Nobody is crazy with money, not even the people who seem like they are. Here's why. Every single person on this planet has had a unique experience with money. Where you were born, when you were born, what your parents earned, what the economy looked like during your formative years, all of these shape how you think about saving, spending, risk, and reward. And those experiences are so powerful that they override everything else. Housel points to a study by economists Malmendier and Nagel, who examined 50 years of financial data. What they found was striking. People's investment decisions throughout their entire lives are heavily anchored to what the economy did during their youth. If you grew up during a period of high inflation, you tended to avoid bonds for life. If you grew up when the stock market was booming, you invested more aggressively forever, not because of intelligence, not because of education, simply because of the dumb luck of when and where you were born. Consider this. If you were born in 1970 in America, the stock market went up nearly tenfold during your teens and 20s. That's incredible. You'd grow up believing stocks are a wealth machine. But if you were born just 20 years earlier, in 1950, the market went essentially nowhere during those same formative years. You'd see stocks as a waste of time. Same country, same markets, completely different lessons, just because of a birth year. Now think about lottery tickets. Americans spend more money on lotto tickets each year than on movies, video games, music, sporting events, and books combined. And who buys them? Mostly the poorest households, spending about $400 a year, even though 40% of Americans say they couldn't cover a $400 emergency. That seems insane, right? But Housel asks us to strain a little and see it from their perspective. These are people living paycheck to paycheck. Savings feel impossible. A nicer life feels out of reach. A lottery ticket is the only time they can hold a tangible dream of having the things others take for granted. They're not buying a ticket. They're buying hope. You don't have to agree with it, but can you understand it? That's the point. What seems crazy to you might make perfect sense to someone whose life has been shaped by completely different experiences. And here's another reason we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. The entire modern financial system is remarkably new. The 401k didn't exist until 1978. The Roth IRA wasn't created until 1998. Consumer credit cards, index funds, widespread mortgages, all of these are younger than most of the people using them. We're all basically beginners in a game that looks ancient but is actually brand new. Now that we understand nobody is crazy, Housel introduces two forces that shape every financial outcome more than we'd ever like to admit: luck and risk. And he argues they're siblings, two sides of the exact same coin. Let's talk about Bill Gates. You know the story. Brilliant kid, obsessed with computers, co-founded Microsoft, became one of the richest people in history. But here's the part most people miss. In 1968, there were roughly 303 million high school-age people on the planet. About 18 million lived in the United States. About 100,000 lived in the Seattle area, and only about 300 of them attended Lakeside School, one of the only high schools in the world that had a computer. Let that sink in. 300 out of 303 million. Gates himself has said it plainly. If there had been no Lakeside, there would have been no Microsoft. He was staggeringly smart and incredibly hardworking, but he also had a 1 in a million head start that most people never mention. Now here's the part that really hits. Bill Gates had a best friend at Lakeside named Kent Evans. Kent was every bit as brilliant with computers as Gates. The two were inseparable, scheming about becoming CEOs, dreaming about their future company. Kent could have been a founding partner of Microsoft, but Kent Evans died in a mountaineering accident before he graduated high school. The odds of dying on a mountain while in high school are roughly 1 in a million. The same odds as attending a school like Lakeside. Think about it. Bill Gates experienced 1 in a million luck. Kent Evans experienced 1 in a million risk. Same magnitude, same force, opposite directions, and this is the uncomfortable truth about money. The forces beyond your control can be more consequential than the ones within it. We want to believe success is earned and failure is deserved, but the line between bold and reckless, between genius and lucky, is often invisible, visible only in hindsight. So what do we do with this knowledge? Two things. First, be careful who you praise and who you look down upon. Not all success is earned, not all failure is deserved. Second, focus less on studying extreme individuals, the billionaires, the spectacular failures, and more on broad patterns. The more extreme the outcome, the more luck or risk was probably involved, and the less applicable it is to your own life. As Housel puts it, nothing is as good or as bad as it seems. So if luck plays a huge role and nobody's crazy, then the real question becomes, when do you stop? When do you have enough? Because here's the terrifying truth. Some of the most successful people in history destroyed themselves because they couldn't answer that question. Rajat Gupta was born in Kolkata, India, orphaned as a teenager, no privilege, no safety net. Despite all of that, by his mid-40s, he had become the CEO of McKinsey, the most prestigious consulting firm in the world. He partnered with Bill Gates on philanthropic work. He sat on the boards of 5 public companies. He was worth an estimated $100 million, and it wasn't enough. Gupta sat on the board of Goldman Sachs, surrounded by billionaires, and reportedly, he didn't want to be a 100 millionaire anymore. He wanted to be in the billionaire circle, so he found a shortcut. In 2008, when Warren Buffett was about to invest $5 billion into Goldman Sachs during the financial crisis, a deal that would send Goldman's stock soaring. Gupta learned about it during a confidential board call. 16 seconds after the call ended, he picked up the phone and called a hedge fund manager. That manager immediately bought 175,000 shares. Gupta went to prison for insider trading. His career, his reputation, his freedom, all gone. For a man who already had more money than 99.9% of humans who have ever lived, ask yourself, why? Why would someone with $100 million risk everything to get more? The answer is what Housel calls the goalpost problem. When your expectations rise with your results, there's no logic in striving for more, because you'll feel the same after every achievement. One step forward just pushes the goalpost 2 steps ahead. And the only way to catch up is to take bigger and bigger risks. Warren Buffett described this phenomenon perfectly when talking about the hedge fund long-term capital management, whose traders, each personally worth tens or hundreds of millions, risked everything and lost it all during the strongest economy in history. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, to make money they didn't have and didn't need, they risked what they did have and did need. It is just plain foolish. There are things in life that are never worth risking, no matter the potential gain. Your reputation, your freedom, your family, your peace of mind. And the hardest financial skill in the world isn't finding the next great investment. It's getting the goalpost to stop moving, knowing when you have enough. But here's the good news. The most powerful tool for building enough doesn't require taking huge risks. It just requires time. Let me ask you something. What causes an ice age? You'd probably guess massive forces, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, something dramatic. But the real answer is almost comically subtle. In the early 1900s, a Serbian scientist named Milutin Milankovic figured out that slight changes in Earth's tilt affect how much sunlight each hemisphere receives. But here's the twist that everyone missed at first. Ice ages aren't caused by brutally cold winters. They're caused by summers that are just slightly too cool to melt the previous winter's snow. That leftover snow reflects more sunlight, which makes the next winter snowier, which makes the next summer even less effective at melting. And within a few hundred years, a thin layer of leftover snow that nobody would have noticed becomes a continental ice sheet miles thick. That's compounding. You don't need a tremendous force to create a tremendous result. You just need a small thing that lasts. And so it is with money. Here's the number that should blow your mind. As Housel was writing this book, Warren Buffett's net worth was $84.5 billion. Of that, $81.5 billion came after his 65th birthday. Virtually all of his wealth was accumulated in old age. Now here's the thought experiment. If Buffett had started investing at 30 instead of 10 and retired at 60 instead of continuing, his net worth, using the same incredible returns, would be roughly $12 million, not $84 billion. 12 million. That's 99.9% less. His skill is investing, but his secret is time. There's a hedge fund manager named Jim Simmons who actually earns much higher annual returns than Buffett, 66% per year compared to Buffett's 22%. And yet Simmons is 75% less wealthy. Why? Because he didn't start until his 50s. He had less than half the compounding time. We struggle with this because our brains think linearly. If I ask you to add 8 plus 8 plus 8 9 times, you can do it quickly. It's 72. But if I ask you to multiply 8 times 8 times 8 9 times, your brain breaks. The answer is over 134 million. That's the gap between how we think and how compounding actually works. And it explains why the most important financial book ever written should probably just be called Shut Up and Wait. Good investing isn't about the highest returns. It's about good returns you can sustain for the longest possible time. That's when compounding does its magic. But there's a catch. You have to survive long enough for it to work. October 1929. The stock market is crashing. Wall Street is in chaos. Reports of speculators committing suicide are spreading across New York. Jesse Livermore walks through the door of his home. His wife Dorothy is in tears. His children are crying. His mother-in-law is hiding in another room screaming. Jesse stands there confused for a moment. Then he realizes what they think has happened, and he tells them the truth. He had bet against the market. He was short. In a single day, he had made the equivalent of more than $3 billion. His family went from terror to celebration in seconds. Meanwhile, a man named Abraham Germansky, a wealthy real estate developer who had bet big on stocks, was last seen on Wall Street, tearing up ticker tape and scattering it as he walked. He was never heard from again. Here you have the ultimate contrast. Same week, same market. One man became fabulously rich, the other was destroyed. But here's what makes this story haunting. Fast forward 4 years. Jesse Livermore, overflowing with confidence after his 1929 triumph, kept making bigger and bigger bets. He took on more and more debt, and he lost everything. Eventually, Livermore took his own life. Both men were brilliant at getting wealthy. Neither could stay wealthy. And Housel argues this is the most important distinction in all of finance. Getting money requires optimism, risk-taking, and putting yourself out there. Keeping money requires the exact opposite: humility, frugality, and a healthy dose of paranoia. Consider Warren Buffett's partner Charlie Munger and their old friend Rick Guerin. All three were equally talented investors, but Rick was in a hurry. He used leverage, borrowed money to amplify his returns. Then the market dropped 70% in the early 70s, and Rick got margin calls. He was forced to sell his Berkshire Hathaway shares to Buffett for under $40 each. Those shares are now worth over $500,000 each. Rick was just as smart. He just couldn't survive. And survival is the whole game. It's not the flashiest strategy. It's not the highest returns. It's the ability to stick around long enough for compounding to work. What did Buffett actually do to get so rich? He didn't use debt. He didn't panic during 14 recessions. He didn't burn himself out and quit. He survived. And that gave him 75 years of compounding. Here's something most people don't understand about success. Most of the time, you can be wrong a lot and still win big. Because in business, investing, and life, a tiny number of events account for the majority of results. Housel calls these tail events. Consider Heinz Berggruen, one of the most successful art dealers in history. He fled Nazi Germany, settled in America, and eventually built a collection of Picassos, Clays, and Matisses worth over $1 billion. How did one person pick so many masterpieces? The answer is simpler than you'd think. He bought everything he could, massive quantities, and then he waited. Maybe 99% of what he bought turned out to be unremarkable, but the 1% that turned out to be Picasso made the rest irrelevant. Walt Disney followed the same pattern. By the mid-1930s, he had produced more than 400 cartoons. Most of them lost money. His first studio went bankrupt. Then Snow White came along and earned $8 million in 6 months. That single film, 83 minutes out of hundreds of hours, paid off every debt, funded a new studio, and made Disney a legend. The same thing happens in the stock market. 40% of all stocks in the Russell 3000 index lost at least 70% of their value and never recovered. But the 7% that massively outperformed drove virtually all of the index's returns. Even venture capital works this way. 65% of investments lose money, but the rare massive winners make the whole industry profitable. So what does this mean for you? It means it's completely normal for most of your decisions to not work out. Warren Buffett has owned 400 to 500 stocks in his lifetime and made most of his money on roughly 10 of them. Peter Lynch, one of the greatest investors ever, said if you're terrific in this business, you're right 6 times out of 10. But here's the key. You don't need to be right most of the time. You need to be in the game long enough for the tails to find you, and you need to not panic when the majority of your bets go sideways, because that's just how the math works. Now let's talk about the thing money can actually buy that matters most. It's not cars, it's not houses, it's not vacations. The highest form of wealth is the ability to wake up every morning and say, I can do whatever I want today. Psychologist Angus Campbell spent his career studying what makes people happy. And after years of research, he found the most powerful common denominator wasn't income. It wasn't geography, it wasn't education, it was a sense of control over your life. More than your salary, more than the size of your house, more than the prestige of your job. Control over what you do, when you do it, and who you do it with. That's the broadest variable that determines human happiness. Housel shares his own experience here. In college, he dreamed of becoming an investment banker because they made enormous amounts of money. He landed a summer internship at a bank in Los Angeles and thought he'd won the career lottery. On his first day, he realized why bankers earn so much. They work longer and more brutal hours than he thought humanly possible. Going home before midnight was considered a luxury. There was a saying in the office, "If you don't come to work on Saturday, don't bother coming back on Sunday." The work was intellectually stimulating and well paid, but every second of his time belonged to someone else, and that turned what should have been a dream job into one of the most miserable experiences of his life. He lasted 1 month of a 4-month internship. Here's the irony. He loved the work. He wanted to work hard. But doing something you love on a schedule you can't control can feel the same as doing something you hate. This is why money's greatest intrinsic value isn't buying things. It's buying time. A small amount of savings means you can take a few days off when you're sick. A bit more means you can wait for a better job instead of grabbing the first one. 6 months of expenses means you're not terrified of your boss. More still means you can retire when you want to, not when you have to. An entrepreneur named Derek Sivers was once asked to tell the story of how he got rich. He said he earned $20,000 a year in Manhattan, lived on $1,000 a month, and saved $12,000 in 2 years. At 22, he quit his job and became a full-time musician. When his friend asked, "But what about when you sold your company for millions?" Sivers said no, that didn't change his life. The real transformation happened at 22, when $12,000 bought him his freedom. Now here's a quick but powerful idea. If money's greatest value is freedom, then most of what people spend money on is working against that goal. Because here's the truth. Nobody is as impressed with your possessions as you are. Housel learned this as a valet. Every day he watched Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Rolls-Royces pull up, and he realized something. He never once looked at a driver and thought, "That person is cool." He looked at the car and thought, "If I had that car, people would think I'm cool." The people driving those cars probably thought everyone was admiring them. But everyone was just admiring the car and imagining themselves in it. There's a paradox here. People buy expensive things to signal that they should be liked and admired. But the observers don't actually admire the person. They use that person's wealth as a benchmark for their own desires. So if what you actually want is respect and admiration, you're more likely to get it through kindness and humility than through horsepower and chrome. And this leads to one of the most important distinctions in the entire book. The difference between being rich and being wealthy. Rich is a current income. It's visible. It's the car, the house, the clothes. But wealth is invisible. Wealth is the money you didn't spend. It's the car you didn't buy, the upgrade you declined, the restraint nobody sees. Think about it this way. Someone driving a $100,000 car might be wealthy, or they might just be $100,000 poorer than they were last month. The car tells you nothing about their actual financial position. It only tells you they spent money. The singer Rihanna nearly went bankrupt from overspending and sued her financial advisor. The advisor's response was essentially, did someone really need to explain to her that if you spend money on things, you end up with things and not money? You can laugh. But the answer is yes, people do need to hear this. Because when most people say they want to be a millionaire, what they actually mean is they want to spend $1 million. And that's literally the opposite of being a millionaire. The tragedy is that wealth is hidden by nature. So we can't learn from wealthy people the way we learn from other role models. Ronald Read was nobody's financial inspiration while he was alive, because every penny of his wealth was invisible. It was only after he died that people discovered his fortune and held him up as an example. How do you learn from what you can't see? Which brings us to the simplest and most overlooked lesson in all of finance. Save money. That's it. Housel makes a brilliant comparison here. In the 1970s, the world thought it was running out of oil. Demand was surging, supply couldn't keep up. Doomsday predictions were everywhere. We didn't run out of oil, but not mainly because we found more. The biggest reason was efficiency. Better cars, better factories, better homes. The United States uses 60% less energy per dollar of GDP today than it did in 1950. We grew our energy wealth not by finding more, but by needing less. The same principle applies to your money. Investment returns are uncertain. Markets might cooperate, or they might not. But your savings rate? That's 100% in your control, and it works just as well today as it will tomorrow. So here's a question worth sitting with. If you had to cut your spending by 20% starting tomorrow, could you do it? And more importantly, would you even notice after a month? Here's the part that might sting a little. Past a certain level of income, what you need is just what sits below your ego. Spending beyond basic comfort is mostly a reflection of ego approaching income, a way to show people you have money. And one of the most powerful ways to increase your savings isn't to earn more, it's to raise your humility. You don't even need a specific reason to save. In fact, saving without a goal is the most important kind of saving, because life's biggest expenses are always the ones you can't predict. Now here's a question. Should you try to be perfectly rational with your money? Housel says no. You should aim to be reasonable. And there's an important difference. In the early 1900s, a psychiatrist named Julius Wagner Jureg noticed something strange. His syphilis patients sometimes recovered if they happened to get a fever from an unrelated illness. Fevers help the body fight infection, so he started deliberately injecting patients with malaria to trigger fevers strong enough to fight the syphilis. Some patients died from the treatment, but those who survived had a 60% recovery rate compared to 30% for those left alone. He won the Nobel Prize. Now, fevers help fight infection. That's scientifically proven. But no doctor today prescribes a fever. Why? Because fevers hurt, and people go to the doctor to stop hurting. It may be rational to want a fever when you're sick, but it's not reasonable. And the same applies to money. A mathematically perfect investment strategy means nothing if it gives you so much anxiety that you abandon it during a downturn. Harry Markowitz, who won the Nobel Prize for mathematically proving the optimal way to balance risk and return, invested his own money in a simple 50-50 split between stocks and bonds. Not because it was optimal, because it minimized his regret. The strategy you can stick with through the tough years will always beat the perfect strategy you'll abandon when it gets scary. Love your investments, not because it's financially optimal, but because the endurance it creates is the most underrated force in finance. Here's a trap nearly every investor falls into. We study history, learn the patterns, and assume those patterns will repeat. But Housel makes a provocative argument. The most important events of the future will be the ones history gives us no guide for. They'll be unprecedented. That's what makes them so impactful. Consider this chain of events. 19 hijackers execute the September 11th attacks. The Federal Reserve cuts interest rates to stabilize the economy. Cheap money fuels a housing boom. The housing boom turns into a bubble. The bubble bursts, triggering a global financial crisis. Millions lose their jobs. Millions more flood into colleges seeking better prospects. Student loan debt explodes to $1.6 trillion. It's not intuitive to connect 19 hijackers to the student loan crisis. But that's how a world driven by tail events actually works. One surprise creates a chain reaction that nobody could have predicted. Benjamin Graham, the father of value investing, updated his investment formulas in every new edition of his famous book because the old ones kept becoming obsolete. When asked near the end of his life if detailed stock analysis was still his preferred approach, he said no. The situation had changed too much since he first wrote about it decades earlier. The correct lesson from surprises isn't that we need to predict them better. It's that we should accept we can't predict them at all and build our financial lives accordingly. And that's where this next idea becomes critical. Housel argues that room for error, also called margin of safety, is the single most underappreciated force in all of finance. Professional blackjack card counters know something most gamblers don't. Even when the odds are in your favor, you never bet everything. because the odds being in your favor still means you'll lose plenty of hands. The whole system depends on humility, the acknowledgement that you could be wrong at any time. Benjamin Graham put it beautifully. The entire purpose of a margin of safety, he said, is to make your forecast unnecessary. You don't need to be right about the future if your plan can survive being wrong. Bill Gates understood this from the start. When Microsoft was young, he insisted on keeping enough cash in the bank to cover an entire year of payroll even if zero revenue came in. That seems extreme, but it's exactly why Microsoft survived while countless other tech companies didn't. And sometimes the risks you need to protect against are ones you can't even imagine. Housel shares a story from the Battle of Stalingrad. A German tank unit had over 100 tanks in reserve. When they were desperately needed on the front lines, engineers discovered that fewer than 20 actually worked. The reason? Field mice had crawled into the tanks during weeks of inactivity and eaten through the electrical wiring. The most sophisticated military equipment in the world, defeated by mice. No tank designer plans for that. But that's exactly the point. The risks that destroy you are the ones you never saw coming, and the only defense is room for error. Cash in the bank, flexibility in your plan, the ability to survive what you can't predict. Here's another reason room for error matters. You're going to change. Not just your circumstances, you, your goals, your desires, your definition of a good life. And most of us dramatically underestimate how much. Housel talks about a childhood friend who came from nothing and bulldozed his way through medical school. Becoming a doctor was his lifelong dream. He finally made it. A decade older than his classmates, but he made it. Years later, they reconnected. The author barely got out a hello before his friend cut in. Awful career. The stress and the hours had ground him down. He was as disappointed in his achievement as he was driven toward it 15 years earlier. Psychologists call this the end of history illusion, the tendency to recognize how much we've changed in the past, while assuming we're basically done changing now. Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert found that people at every age, from 18 to 68, underestimate how different they'll be in the future. So what does this mean for your money? It means you should avoid extremes. Don't commit to an austere life of deprivation, and don't sacrifice your health and relationships chasing maximum income. Both create regret when you inevitably become a different person. Aim for balance at every stage. Moderate savings, moderate free time, moderate ambition, because balance is what gives you the endurance to keep compounding without having to start over. And when your goals do change, let go of sunk costs. Don't stay loyal to a career or a plan just because 18-year-old you chose it. The quicker you can adjust, the sooner you can get back to letting compounding work. Now let's talk about the price of investing success. Because nothing worthwhile is free. And the biggest mistake people make is trying to get something for nothing. The stock market has delivered extraordinary long-term returns, but the price of those returns, and there is always a price, is volatility. Fear, doubt, uncertainty, the stomach-churning feeling of watching your portfolio drop 30, 40, 50%. Housel reframes this beautifully. Think of it like a Disneyland ticket. It costs $100, and millions of people happily pay it for an amazing experience. Nobody calls that a punishment. It's a fee, the cost of admission. Market volatility is the same thing. It's not a fine for doing something wrong. It's a fee for getting something good, long-term returns. But because the price isn't printed on a tag, it feels like a penalty, and that feeling drives people to try to avoid it entirely. They time the market. They sell when things get scary. They buy tactical funds promising upside without the downside. And almost every time, they end up worse off. Morningstar found that the average fund investor underperformed the very funds they invested in by 0.5% per year because they bought and sold at the wrong times. The trick is to convince yourself the fee is worth paying, because it is. Volatility is the admission ticket to the best amusement park in finance. If you try to sneak in without paying, by avoiding the scary rides, you usually end up paying double. Here's another subtle trap that can cost you a fortune. You might be taking financial cues from someone who's playing a completely different game than you. Ask yourself, How much should you pay for a share of any company? The answer depends entirely on who you are. A day trader who's going to sell by lunchtime has a completely different rational price than a 30-year retirement investor. But they're both trading the same stock at the same time on the same exchange. This is how bubbles form. During the dot-com era, average mutual fund turnover was 120%, meaning investors were holding stocks for roughly 8 months. These weren't long-term believers in the internet's future. They were short-term momentum traders for whom even ridiculous prices made sense because they only needed the stock to go up for a few weeks. The tragedy was that long-term investors saw those prices, assumed they must be rational, and followed along, playing a game they didn't realize wasn't theirs. So write down what game you're playing. Seriously. Are you a 30-year investor, a 5-year saver, a day trader? Once you know, ignore everything that doesn't apply to your game. When a talking head on television says buy this stock, they have no idea who you are or what your goals are. That advice might be perfect for someone else and catastrophic for you. Now let's talk about something that affects all of us but few of us recognize. Pessimism is seductive. It sounds smart, it commands attention, and it's almost always wrong in the long run. In December 2008, during the worst economic crisis in modern history, the Wall Street Journal published a front-page story by a Russian professor who predicted the United States would break apart into 6 pieces within 2 years, with California going to China, Texas to Mexico, and Alaska reverting to Russian control. This was not a fringe blog. This was the front page of the most respected financial newspaper in the world. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine if a Japanese scholar in 1946, when famine limited food to 800 calories per person per day, had written an article saying Japan's economy would grow to 15 times its pre-war size, life expectancy would nearly double, and the stock market would deliver historic returns. They would have been immediately dismissed as delusional. But that's exactly what happened. The optimistic prediction came true. The pessimistic one was absurd. Yet the pessimist gets the front page and the optimist gets dismissed. Let's get brutally honest for a moment. How much of your financial anxiety comes from actual problems? And how much comes from headlines designed to scare you? Here's why pessimism wins attention. Financial losses are universal. A recession threatens everyone. Progress is slow and quiet. Setbacks are instant and loud. Heart disease deaths have fallen 70% since 1965, saving roughly 500,000 American lives per year. But because that progress happened slowly over decades, it captures a fraction of the attention given to a single plane crash. The Wright brothers achieved the first flight in 1903. The world didn't fully accept it until 1908, 4.5 years of human flight ignored. But one of the first major aviation headlines was about a crash that killed an Army lieutenant. Growth is invisible. Tragedy is instant. This doesn't mean pessimism is wrong. Bad things happen. What it means is that pessimism gets more attention than it deserves, and optimism gets less. The smart approach is what Housel calls sensible optimism, the belief that the odds are in your favor over time, even when the road between here and there is filled with landmines. And here's why pessimism is so powerful. We are wired to fill gaps in our knowledge with stories that feel complete, even when they're not. Housel's daughter was about a year old when he wrote this chapter. She had no idea what a salary, a budget, or a retirement account was. But she didn't wander around confused. She had her own complete narrative. Blankets keep you warm, mom keeps you safe, and dates taste good. Everything fit neatly into her worldview. Adults do the exact same thing. We look at incomplete information, construct a story that makes sense to us, and then treat that story as though it's the truth. And this has massive implications for our financial decisions. Think about an alien hovering over New York City on New Year's Eve 2007, then again on New Year's Eve 2009. He'd see the same buildings, the same people, the same technology, actually better technology, same factories, same patents, same universities. By every tangible measure, the world in 2009 was as capable as 2007. But households were $16 trillion poorer. 10 million more people were unemployed. The stock market had been cut in half. The only thing that changed was the stories we told ourselves. In 2007, we believed housing prices would keep rising and banks were prudent. In 2009, we stopped believing. That shift in narrative and nothing else created the worst economic crisis in 80 years. This is why appealing fictions are so dangerous. When the stakes are high and control is low, we'll believe almost anything that offers a feeling of certainty. It's why people listen to TV pundits with terrible track records, invest in funds that consistently underperform, and trust forecasts that are almost always wrong. We don't want the truth. We want to feel like the world makes sense. The only defense is intellectual humility, accepting that what you don't know is far more powerful than what you do, and building enough room for error that your ignorance can't destroy you. In the final chapters of this book, Housel pulls everything together into actionable wisdom. Let me give you the most powerful takeaways. Number 1, find humility when things are going well and compassion when things go wrong, because nothing is ever as good or as bad as it seems. Luck and risk are always in the mix. Number 2, less ego, more wealth. Wealth is what you don't spend. You will never build wealth unless you can put a lid on what you consume today to have more options tomorrow. Number 3, manage your money in a way that helps you sleep at night. Not the way that maximizes returns, not the way a textbook recommends, the way that lets you close your eyes without worry. Number 4, if you want to be a better investor, increase your time horizon. Time is the most powerful force in all of investing. It makes small things grow big and big mistakes fade away. Number 5, get comfortable with a lot of things going wrong. Tails drive everything. You can be wrong half the time and still build a fortune, as long as your winners outweigh your losers. Think about that. You can be wrong half the time and still build a fortune. Does that change how you feel about the investments that didn't work out? Number 6, use money to control your time. It pays the highest dividend that exists. Number 7, nobody is as impressed with your possessions as you are. Kindness and humility earn more respect than any luxury purchase ever will. Number 8, save. You don't need a reason. Save for the surprises you can't predict, because they're coming. Number 9, define the cost of success and pay it willingly. Volatility and uncertainty aren't punishments, they're admission tickets. Number 10, worship room for error. It's the only way to stay in the game long enough for the odds to work in your favor. Housel ends the book by showing you his cards. Here's how he actually manages his money, not what sounds smart, but what works for him. His family's goal is independence, not maximum returns, not luxury, just waking up every day with the freedom to do what they want on their own terms. He and his wife established their lifestyle in their 20s with entry-level salaries, comfortable, but nothing fancy. Despite years of rising incomes, they've barely changed that lifestyle. Every raise goes to savings. They own their house outright, with no mortgage. On paper, this is the worst financial decision they could make. Mortgage rates were absurdly low, and investing that money would generate higher returns. But the feeling of independence, no monthly payment, nobody can take their home, is worth more to them than any spreadsheet says they're missing. They keep about 20% of their non-house assets in cash, way more than any advisor would recommend. But it means they'll never be forced to sell stocks to cover an emergency. And not being forced to sell is how they maximize compounding time. Every dollar they invest goes into low-cost Vanguard index funds. No stock picking, no timing, no complicated strategies, just consistent contributions and patience. He puts it simply, he doesn't believe there's much correlation between investment effort and investment results. The world is driven by tails. A few things matter enormously, and everything else is noise. His strategy doesn't rely on picking the right sector or timing the next recession. It relies on 3 things: a high savings rate, patience, and optimism that the global economy will keep creating value over the coming decades. That's it. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated, just the psychology of money put into practice. So here's the question this book leaves you with. What does enough look like for you? Not for your neighbor, not for the person you follow on social media. For you, Morgan Housel spent 20 chapters proving that the gap between the rich and the wealthy, between the smart and the successful, between the educated and the financially free, isn't found in spreadsheets or stock charts. It's found in behavior, in patience, in humility, in knowing what game you're playing and ignoring everyone else's. You don't need to be a genius. You don't need a fancy degree. You don't need to pick perfect stocks or time the market just right. You need to save more than you think, stay invested longer than feels comfortable, define what enough looks like, and never risk what you have and need for what you don't have and don't need. The most powerful financial skill in the world isn't analysis, it's temperament. And temperament is something every single one of us can develop. Take a moment. Think about your own relationship with money. Which of these ideas hit you the hardest? Which one made you see your financial life differently? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear which chapter changed your perspective. If you want to go deeper, I've put links to get the full book on Amazon and listen free on Audible in the description below. This is one of those books that rewards rereading. And if this video helped you see money in a new light, subscribe and hit the bell. Every week, we break down the world's most powerful books so you can get the key ideas in one sitting. Because you might be just one book away from the insight that changes everything. Remember, the power to change your financial story is already in your hands. It always has been. It's not about what you know, it's about how you behave. Choose wisely.